Well, here's what nobody wants to admit. The Phil Leotardo hit wasn't brilliance. It was a sloppy panic move disguised as strategy. The execution of Phil Leotardo has long been treated as a tactical masterstroke. If by tactical, one means reckless, to the point of slapstick. It is difficult to imagine a more conspicuously public setting than a gas station, a place built on a foundation of camera domes and bored attendants. Yet the hit rolls out in full daylight, surrounded by startled onlookers, with Walden strolling up barefaced, the getaway car's plates gleaming as clearly as his intent. In any other world, this would be the definition of begging to be caught, but in the late-stage unraveling of this crew, recklessness had essentially become policy. The defenders of this circus act point to the ongoing war. The argument goes that, during wartime, opportunity outranks subtlety. When the target appears, you strike regardless of family members, witnesses, or the mild inconvenience of gasoline pumps equipped with surveillance. And given Phil's talent for vanishing into whatever fortified hideout he was currently panicking inside, urgency did play a role. Follow him too long and he bolts. Wait for discretion and he relocates. For the crew, it was hit on sight or enjoy another 6 months of funerals. Walden himself remains an enigma, largely because the story never bothered to show who he was. He could easily have been another Jackie Jr., a proudly unqualified amateur desperate to prove himself. One can practically hear the diagnosis, cowboyitis, the ailment of young men determined to demonstrate toughness by ignoring every principle of self-preservation. There is a long local history of such afflictions. Phil once threatened Christopher's mother, another associate threatened Meadow, lawns were desecrated, families traumatized, and in the end, the boss himself met a quiet, public fate. The show has always been fond of symmetrical violence. The hit's apparent irrationality becomes easier to accept when one stops pretending gas station cameras of 2007 offered anything resembling clarity. They were often broken, grainy enough to flatter a Bigfoot sighting, and usually recorded onto tapes handled with the delicate professionalism of a sandwich wrapper. Even today, real-world murders in similar locations often go unsolved. Detectives typically solve crimes through one of three ancient methods: catching someone in the act, somebody talking, or the perpetrator being so obviously tied to the victim that solving the crime is more bookkeeping than investigation. Absent a witness willing to identify Walden, a laughable prospect, law enforcement would have little to go on. The fantasy of DNA from a raindrop exists mostly in television procedurals. It is worth noting that nobody in this world ever seems to fear fingerprints unless a plot specifically demands it. If a killer like Walden has no criminal record, identifying him from a camera still is basically a game of short guy with dark hair. He can disappear, the car can disappear. The plates were almost certainly either stolen or registered to a ghost identity, and the handful of horrified bystanders are unlikely to risk involvement. The "oh shit" witness would need a memory sharper than a cross-examination. The chaotic, muddled nature of the crew itself made sloppiness inevitable. Their mismanagement had become a culture. Leadership delegated down the chain until the job landed in the least reliable hands. Bobby was originally supposed to coordinate the hit, passed it to Polly, who passed it to Patsy, who lacked Christopher's rapport with their hired help. The result was the infamous botched attempt that killed the wrong people and sent Phil into a paranoid bunker. By the time the final opportunity arose, Bobby was dead, Silvio comatose, Carlo flipped, and Polly behaving like someone who had peeked behind the cosmic curtain and didn't like what he saw. Competence had left the building long before Phil did. In this climate, hesitation equaled failure when Phil finally surfaced. In that unglamorous corner of Oyster Bay, they moved. It was not elegant. Had they waited for his family to leave or tailed him to a more discreet location, they might never have got a second chance. The target was on permanent high alert. The slightest hint of pursuit would have sent him running to yet another safe house, or to Butchie for reinforcements, prolonging the conflict indefinitely. All of this explains the sloppiness, but not the symbolism. Killing Phil in front of his family was not merely pragmatic, it carried a message. Phil had already violated one of the unwritten rules by escalating a personal feud into a full-scale war aimed at wiping out another boss entirely, an act only permissible with the Commission's blessing. When permission was finally granted to remove him, it implicitly sanctioned the theatrics as well. If a man insists on behaving like a medieval warlord, the response may as well be staged like a medieval warning. A boss dies publicly, his head literally crushed, and the world is reminded that certain lines have consequences. The irony is that the spectacle likely invited the finale's ambiguous retaliation. If one subscribes to the interpretation that Tony meets his end in that closing scene, the motive is almost poetic. Phil was executed in front of his family, and the favor was returned. Even if this reading is debatable, the thematic symmetry is unmistakable. Violence becomes hereditary. Traditions endure, just not the noble ones. Some defenders insist the hit was completely realistic, citing well-known real-world examples of bosses being taken down in broad daylight on Manhattan sidewalks. Professional killers, they argue, know what they're doing. Of course, other examples from the show contradict this competence. Certain murders are conducted with such casual disregard for evidence that it borders on parody. Christopher leaves fingerprints on everything except the door he remembers to open with his sleeve. Everyone behaves as though DNA is stored in a magical database with their names printed underneath. Yet simultaneously, killers vanish into the night without consequence. The truth is that the show is selective with realism. The volume of public murders far exceeds anything even the most murderous era of organized crime ever produced, but this exaggerated frequency serves a narrative function. The family's operations are built on corner cutting, impulsiveness, and a perpetual commitment to doing things the wrong way, because the right way requires effort, patience, and discipline, qualities that evaporated long ago. The crew no longer resembles a well-oiled criminal enterprise. They are a glorified crew stumbling through a war they barely understand, governed by half-remembered rules and egos far larger than their operational competence. The hit on Phil thus becomes the culmination of everything the crew had devolved into: sloppy, rushed, desperate, but grimly determined. When their best soldiers were dead, flipped, hospitalized, or unreliable, a relatively unknown figure with more enthusiasm than experience volunteered for what amounted to a one-way demonstration of loyalty. His reward? Immediate status as an OG, decades in prison if he were caught, and the possibility of returning from a long vacation should he choose to reappear once the heat dissipated. Even the logistical objections fail to land when placed in context. The camera might not have been active. Even if it was, quality would be abysmal, the car likely untraceable, witnesses stunned, the family at war, the opportunity fleeting, the urgency absolute. In a world where the insurance lapse from a car chase qualifies as a narrative repercussion, it is miraculous the crew achieved anything resembling a decisive victory. Consider also that the truce arranged with New York hinged precariously on Phil being removed quickly. Butchie and Albie refused to help or reveal Phil's location, and might have reneged entirely if the war dragged on. Killing him immediately was the only way to stabilize the agreement, and perhaps the only way to prevent New York from deciding that both problems, Phil and Tony, could be solved with equal efficiency. What remains then is the essential point. The hit was reckless because recklessness had become their operating philosophy. It reflected the show's central argument that these men are not brilliant tacticians but small-time operators inflated by mythology, bungling their way through crises with equal parts bravado and incompetence. The spectacle at the gas station is not an exception but the rule. And if one traces the thematic pattern to its endpoint, the conclusion is bleakly elegant. Phil Leotardo was killed in front of his family, and inevitably, Tony Soprano would be as well, symmetry being the only tradition this world still remembers how to honor. Subscribe.